Welcome everyone to this Society of Labour Lawyers webinar on the Northern Ireland Protocol. I won't say very much. We have a very distinguished range of speakers. David Henig at ECPE, I'm not quite sure how you pronounce it, but ECPE is a well-known trade expert. It's a well-established member of Trade Twitter and a commentator on and expert on these issues. Chris McCrudden is a professor of law at Queen's University Belfast and an editor of the recent textbook series of essays on the Northern Ireland Protocol, which is available from Cambridge University Press and is invaluable to anyone who has to advise or think about this area. And we're also particularly grateful for Eleonor coming in at short notice. Eleonor is a partner at, Eleonor, I've forgotten your firm, which is
Bates Wells.
Bates Wells, yeah. But was in a previous incarnation in the government legal service and played a role in the drafting of the withdrawal agreement, although she tells me not particularly the Northern Ireland Protocol. So very grateful for them. And without more ado, I shall hand over to Eleonor.
Thank you very much indeed, George. It's great to be here this evening, and I'm very much looking forward to this discussion. So just to give you a sense of the shape of it, we're going to first be looking at the relevant background and the so-called trilemma, which we're going to explain to you. Then we'll go on to discuss the effect of Brexit in Northern Ireland, to look at the protocol itself, and then the main focus of the discussion is where do we go from here. We'll have time at the end for some Q&A, so do use the put your hand up function and we'll come to you and you can ask your question. When you're asking your question, please do explain who you are and put on your video. That would be very helpful. Otherwise, do feel free to put a question in the chat and we'll come to it. This session and the Q&A will be recorded, just so you know that. Right, so without further ado, let's start with the background and the trilemma. So David, I think you were going to start off with taking us through this particular aspect.
Yes, in a nutshell, and thank you, Eleonor. So as well as working with ESIP, various UK organisations, I've spent quite a lot of time specialising in matters of trade and regulation. And matters of trade and regulation are at the heart of the Irish trilemma. And the Irish trilemma running out of Brexit was this: there are international borders, and one of the main reasons there are international borders is to check goods going across those borders to make sure they meet relevant regulations and that their customs have been paid on them. And those checks are particularly prevalent in the area of food and drink. And the Irish trilemma just simply says either the whole of the UK aligns with the EU, or you are going to need a border either on the land of Ireland or in the Irish Sea. And that was simply the Irish trilemma, and that there was no good way to get out of it. Now, it was expressed in variously different ways by a couple of think tankers academics, John Springford from CER, Daniel Kellerman, but essentially it was that. Either you've got a border or you've got alignment, and if you have a border, where are you going to put it? Now, I'm going to slightly steal Christopher's thunder and go beyond that and say two more bits. One, there's clearly an identity issue overlaid on that, because in Northern Ireland, where in a sense you have people who part of the Good Friday Agreement, people who think that they are Irish, people who think that they are British, and the absence of checks and controls either way is a part of that identity. And the second part I'm going to say about this is that regulation is the main business of government in the 21st century, but it's mostly hidden. And so what we're seeing in the Northern Ireland Protocol is normally the hidden wiring of government, but none of this is terribly surprising, the sort of issues that are arising. It's just that normally they're not they're not. Most of them are not that controversial, but in Northern Ireland they are.
Yes, yes, absolutely, and so that's the background, really. I mean, Christopher, could you take us through the effect of Brexit in Northern Ireland? So how that's really played out, what a bit more detail perhaps about the settlement, and how that's working on the ground. I think you're on mute.
You would think I'd learned by this time. I do apologize. So I think it's worth distinguishing the effect of the protocol from the effect of Brexit. And we're going to focus largely on the protocol, but the background is the effect of Brexit itself, which the protocol was trying to alleviate to some degree. So in my view, the effect has been wholly negative, in the sense that it accomplished about 6 things. Each of them is important, unfortunately, for the question of what to do about it. So first, it destroyed trust between all political actors and the UK government. So the one thing that Northern Ireland political parties are united in is not trusting the government. And that's probably the only thing they agree on. And that absence of trust, I think, is a major question that we're going to have to return to. Second, it brought the Irish land border back into political contention in a way that everybody had thought was largely behind us. So one of the major achievements of the Good Friday Agreement was to make the border largely irrelevant. And given the type of hard Brexit that was adopted by the UK government, it was inevitable that the border, as David has said, was going to come as a central point of contention, a border somewhere. So third consequence of Brexit was stoking sectarianism. So Brexit itself has now become a sectarian issue. Vast proportion of Catholics and nationalists, they're not the same necessarily, are against Brexit and in favor of variations of the protocol. The significant section of the unionist population is voted for Brexit, over 60%, something like that, and is skeptical of the protocol to various degrees. So it's become a sectarian issue. Fourth, it increased discussion of Irish unification and increased its support among the Catholic middle class to an extent that certainly I was extremely surprised about. So we now have essentially a situation where it's roughly 40% are going to vote against unification, 40% something are going to vote in favor of it, at least according to the opinion polls, and about 20% are in the middle. So, were there to be a unification poll, which I don't think is actually likely in the near future, it would depend essentially on that 20%, that middle 20% of uncommitteds at the moment, as to how it would go. And that 20% is largely very skeptical of the British government's approach and largely pro-EU. So fifth effect has been to bring renewed attention from the United States on Northern Ireland. Obviously, critical actor in terms of the 1980s, critical actor in the 1990s, then a long period of quiescence. And now with the Biden administration, it has come back roaring with attention, both from the White House and from Congress, with the effects on potential trade agreements, of course, as we know. And sixth and lastly, Brexit has entrenched support for the EU in the Republic of Ireland. And essentially the Republic of Ireland had to decide whether it was going to go to Britain or whether it was going to go to the EU. And it's chosen to go to the EU, really without any hesitation at all among public opinion. And equally, the support for Ireland by the EU has ramped up very significantly in a way which we now see the consequences of. So, we'll talk about what the protocol does, but let's leave the effect of Brexit hanging. And David perhaps will talk us a bit through some of the aspects of the protocol, and then I'll follow up on that.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you, Christopher. So David, if we could move then onto the protocol and just look, if you could give us a sense of the overall structure of it and how it functions.
Yes, indeed. Now, I get into trouble for saying this, but I'm going to say it anyway. The protocol is fundamentally a trade agreement. It perhaps shouldn't be, but that's fundamentally what it is. It is fundamentally the agreement by which the UK and the EU agree on how you're going to avoid having a border on the land of Ireland, and therefore you are going to transfer certain functions from the land border into to the Irish Sea and between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Now that's slightly covered up in some of the opening language. Some of the opening language suggests that you are equally prioritising the UK single market and the EU single market, if you can call the UK a single market. Let's use that language just to make it consistent with the EU single market. So you've essentially then got these two single markets, and whereas they are paid equal service within general speak, and there's lots of talk about nothing should otherwise affect the functioning of the UK single market. In effect, that's not actually what it does. So it's a pretty short agreement by international standards, and it's also misleadingly short. It's only 18 articles of this agreement, of which Article 16 is the most famous. And it says how trade is going to be carried out. But the only 18 articles, and however many pages that is, not very many, disguises the fact that actually it's a huge agreement, because those 18 articles include saying that items of EU law shall be valid in Northern Ireland in various annexes. And those annexes, and when you add up the number of EU regulations that are to be followed in Northern Ireland, I think I counted them at some point. There's about 300 of them. So if you then were to add up the number of pages that those constituted, you'd actually start to get into the thousands. So deceptively short, but actually there's a lot behind there. What does it do if we re-aggregate it back? We're saying Northern Ireland is not in the EU single market for services. It is in the EU single market for goods. Anything, in theory, there is full free movement of goods between Northern Ireland and the EU, and therefore, if that causes a clash with free movement from Great Britain to Northern Ireland or vice versa, in that situation, the EU single market comes first. Therefore, this is how checks are going to be carried out on entry to Northern Ireland. Now, some of that explicitly states about customs, about goods at risk, or goods at risk of going into the EU, have to pay customs duties where applicable. But actually, most of the checks that people are talking about are the regulatory checks enshrined within the annexes. And so you get to the stage. This is the stuff about whether goods can be on sale, whether certain foodstuffs, whether mince can be mincemeat or sausage meat that's made in Great Britain can be on sale in Northern Ireland. No, because that regulation does not allow for chilled sausage meat to come from countries outside of the EU into the EU. There is then that leads you on to another issue, which is that all of these regulations are written for the EU, but they need to be interpreted in the field of what they mean for a territory that's following EU rules but is not within the EU. So there's a certain interpretation. That, for example, comes out in where there are quotas and how Northern Ireland fits into quotas. Let's not go into that detail. You start rapidly getting into the detail. There are some other elements that we're not going to really major on now. We have the state aid and how Northern Ireland has to follow an EU state aid regime. we have ECJ jurisdiction over Northern Ireland. Now, to a degree, that makes sense because these are EU regulations that are being applied in Northern Ireland, so you have a ECJ jurisdiction. But if you like, you have a kind of double jurisdiction of the ECJ because you have both ECJ jurisdiction on how the EU regulations are carried out, but also ECJ jurisdiction on how the UK government operates. And many of these checks, it's the UK government that actually has to carry them out, but according to EU law. And so that's roughly where we are. And if we compare it, if we recall briefly the backstops, there were two. There was first a Northern Ireland only backstop, and then there was an all UK backstop, and both were rejected by the Conservative Party. But the one that was considered worse was the Northern Ireland only backstop. Well, in fact, the Northern Ireland only backstop was turned into a front stop, really, by a Prime Minister who decided that was his way to win an election. And subsequent to that, and this is where we'll come in on trust and whatever, you can argue that the UK government has behaved pretty appallingly, and that's a legacy we'll have to deal with. But that's the protocol in as short a version as I think I can do it justice. I have written at a greater length for the Centre for Cross-Border Studies in Northern Ireland about how the protocol arose. So that's available for those wanting to go into more detail.
Thank you, David. That's really helpful, useful summary for us. Christopher, David said at the start, this is fundamentally a trade agreement. Is the protocol about trade, or is it about other issues?
Yeah, of course it's about trade, but it's not only about trade. The point that David made in his previous intervention was that there was an identity question going on here. So the idea that people are sitting down of an evening talking about fishing quotas in Northern Ireland or where sausage meat is going to come from because they're particularly interested in where the sausage meat comes from is clearly not the case. They're interested in it because it has been either turned into or has been seen to be a question of identity. And so, the question about, our tradition of British bangers very quickly becomes, it's all about flag. So that's why it's toxic. Just a couple of points that sort of support this. So although, of course, David is right that the bulk of the agreement in terms of the weight of it and the number of pages is trade. But you also have the provisions dealing with the common travel area. You've got the provisions on North-South cooperation. You've got the provisions on human rights and equality. And you've got essentially, in various ways, the EU now being seen as a co-guarantor of the 1998 Good Friday Agreement. And so the linkage with the agreement is critical. And that isn't in the trade context, primarily. So the Good Friday Agreement says very little about cross-border trade. It's not a trade agreement at all. But the protocol clearly sees one of its aims, indeed its primary aim, as ensuring that the Good Friday Agreement is protected in all its parts. So I don't think that's idle. And I think it's part of the purpose and indeed some of the provisions in the agreement. As to David's point about the agreement is, don't know how I put it, let me put it more bluntly. Clearly the agreement, the protocol is speaking with forked tongue, right? So it says one thing, but it actually does another thing in many of its provisions. So, it says Northern Ireland is within the UK customs arrangements and within the UK internal market, but the practice in terms of the rest of the provisions is very much to weaken both of those propositions, and so on. And part of the reason for that, I don't know whether Eleonor, when you were drafting it, intentionally did this, but of course, some of these ambiguities, and speaking with Fort Ton, was to protect the British government, right? So that it wasn't clear to the Commons in particular what was going on, because otherwise it probably wouldn't have gone through. So for people who don't read the detail, of course all they saw was the headlines, but the headlines were actually camouflage in many respects, which is why the damn thing is so complicated. Last point before we get on to what to do about all of this. This question about trust we have to keep on coming back to. And part of the reason why the governance arrangements are so complicated is because in the absence of trust, you go to law and you go to legal regulation and you try to pile on as many sanctions and as many dispute settlement mechanisms as you can. I would be the last to refer to perfidious Albion, but I suspect in the halls in Brussels that it was a fairly common phrase. And if in that kind of environment, of course, you're going to pile on all of these provisions, in particular, the Court of Justice. Sorry, I said I was going to end at that point. I'll end with one further point, which is the critical point about consent. So clearly tied in with the identity issue is the concern that Northern Ireland was not consenting to this protocol. Now, of course, it didn't consent to Brexit in the first place, right? So it voted majority against it. But now we are where we are, and the question of consent comes roaring back. And there is a critical provision, of course, which is politically important as well as legally, which is that the Assembly will have to sign off on the agreement, the Northern Ireland Assembly, if it comes into existence again after the election in May. So this May election is critical, not just in terms of whether the institutions are going to be up and running again after May, but also it'll form, if the Assembly does come into existence, we're now electing people who are going to be deciding whether or not to continue the protocol, or at least the trade aspects of the protocol. But interesting point, of course, emerges here that the Assembly will not have the role of getting rid of the protocol as a whole. It will only have the opportunity to vote for or against the trade provisions, which emphasizes my point that there's more to the agreement than the trade provisions, and the non-trade provisions will not be subject to Assembly say-so. I'll end at that point, but no doubt we'll talk about it more.
Yes, that's so interesting and helpful. Thank you, Christopher. So let's, I think, move on now to the main sort of meat of what we're here to discuss, which is where do we go from here? So, David, perhaps I could ask you first. In terms of what we do with the protocol here and the difficulties which have arisen, two options seem available. Do we renegotiate it, or do we resolve the difficulties which have arisen using the mechanisms in the protocol?
Right. Okay. So let's, good question. First thing I would say, there isn't an easy answer, and I think that there is a temptation here, strong temptation, to say the UK government has behaved appallingly badly in this. It has basically been trying to overturn what it signed for 2 years. The unionists have been part of that as well. All will be fine now if we simply go to a point of the UK government implementing what it signed. Now, that's very tempting to go down that track. The problem is, I think we're too late for it. I think the appalling behaviour has paid off, in a sense that I don't now think that the protocol as it currently stands is sufficient to create a create a stable political structure in Northern Ireland in the coming years. And I think that after the elections in May, I think that will be seen. I can't, unless something is done, something different, then I don't think we've got devolution and we've got deepening division. So that's where I start. I'm relatively clear that that's 90% the fault of the UK government, but I'm afraid we are we are where we are. Incidentally, it's still 10%. There's 10% of the EU in there. The EU is, if pushed, is always prone to overt legalism. And I don't think that you can, as Christopher suggests, I don't think you can overcome trust with more and more law. And I think that the EU has probably not really thought it through, for example, the ECJ elements of this as to really how enforceable ECJ is outside of actual EU territory. The problem with the protocol, and I've defined it as a stalemate, is that the EU is basically trying to enforce EU law outside of the UK. Well, there's a certain outside the EU. There's a certain amount of power that gives the UK government. On the other hand, the UK government wishes to ignore international trade norms, and that goes down badly with the EU and the US. And it's also thought, I'm not going to comment, but it is widely thought that the UK government is not that fussed about the Good Friday Agreement. And the Good Friday Agreement, you see, is almost turned into a tool whereby we sort of all parties sort of claim to worship the Good Friday Agreement, and you can argue as to how which of them is genuine or not. So my take on this is that we need something new. Now, what do we need new? I feel that what we need is a political layer on top of the existing Good Friday Agreement and protocol, but one that opens the prospect that the protocol will be in some way refined or tweaked as we go along. That political agreement starts to bring in much more serious way the Northern Ireland institutions, who have very limited role as things stand. As things stand, this is an EU-UK arrangement. I don't believe that the institutions that are set up within the withdrawal agreement are sufficient to resolve the issues, partly because they don't have Northern Ireland involvement. So I think you have to have proper involvement from Northern Ireland institutions, political parties, businesses, community groups, etc. You need to, in some way, start to build a shared endeavour, some shared trust. I've no idea how, well, I know how it's done. It's done through incredibly hard work. You need in some way to get all the sides involved, I think, to sign up to some shared principles here that say there are two single markets that are important. There are different communities that are important. We have to respect all of those while also understanding basic trade law. And you have to somehow try and create some shared endeavour. Now, I'm not saying that is in any way easy, nor do I necessarily think it's likely to happen immediately after May. But I don't see an easy alternative to that. That's roughly where I think we have to go. It would be undoubtedly helpful if the UK government was to sign a veterinary agreement and basically align on quite a lot of areas of food, and actually wouldn't make much difference to our trade deals with the rest of the world. But unfortunately, the ideology there doesn't work at the moment. But I think that those are the kind of things that one needs to start looking at once you have some kind of political arrangement in place. Because if you're giving more power, or at least more influence, to Northern Ireland institutions, all of those Northern Ireland institutions believe the UK government could and should go further, for example, on alignment. So you're helping to the pressure there. But essentially, in my judgment, and this is what I wrote a paper on for ESIP, we need a new political structure, but it is not a replacement for the Good Friday Agreement. And only in part does it start to tackle the protocol. You have to take the protocol as a given. The idea of renegotiating the protocol as well at the moment, other than the way it operates, is, I think, is not something that would easily happen. So that's my take, but I'm not completely sure that Christopher agrees.
Christopher, so a layer on top of the protocol, or using the mechanisms within it to try and make this more effective?
The latter. So it's all going so well, right? Up to this point. Look, let's just take it sort of a bit by bit in terms of the particular jigsaw puzzle that's going on here. The one thing David and I really agree with is that this is really difficult, right? So no simple solutions. But let's just start in terms of not the UK, but let's just start with Ireland, right? Because any agreement that's going to go on with regard to Northern Ireland, for it to work, is going to have the agreement of Ireland. And we immediately then enter into this problem that the Good Friday Agreement was obviously, in part at least, an agreement between the UK and Ireland. But now with Brexit, Ireland cannot and will not negotiate except as part of the EU. It cannot, and it will not. And so this makes any attempt, as it were, to do a deal with Ireland, even if Ireland was willing to do it, very, very difficult in the new context. So any agreement, therefore, is going to have to be handled through the EU. Well, good luck with that in the current context. So if what's envisaged, and this isn't David's point, but it was very interesting the way that there's a kind of mission creep that maybe we have to rethink the Good Friday Agreement itself. And that's exactly my concern. And if what's envisaged is a replacement of the agreement or a sort of addition to the agreement, fundamentally, then this is increasingly the loyalist and unionist, hard unionist right position, that it's the Good Friday Agreement that's the problem, not the protocol. And this is dangerous. And it's dangerous because it feeds a kind of further reaches of loyalism, understanding of where exactly they should be going. So it's not just getting rid of the protocol, it is getting rid of the Good Friday Agreement. And the reactions to the judicial decision, the Court of Appeal decision a couple of days ago that upheld the legality and the constitutionality of the protocol was very much in those terms from extreme loyalism. The problem is the agreement itself, the Good Friday Agreement. And the problem is that if you feed that narrative, unionists need to be very careful what they wish for. Because were you to actually, I don't think there's any prospect whatsoever about a renegotiation of the agreement, but if there were to be, then the types of guarantees that the unionist community got in the agreement will also be up for grabs. And I think there's going to be considerably less sympathy in nationalist Ireland for unionist community that pulls down the agreement than there was in the past. So, you know, it's not as if the Good Friday Agreement is not attempting to protect the unionist position here. There is, after all, the fundamental provision which says that Northern Ireland's status vis-a-vis the rest of the United Kingdom will not be changed except with the consent of the majority in the UK. Well, that's up for grabs if you change the agreement. The idea that commitments to parity of esteem in a united Ireland will also be up for grabs. So we can go through it and, you know, parse it bit by bit, but be very careful what you wish for in terms of bringing down the agreement, even from a unionist point of view. So the other problem, I think, with David's idea of a sort of layer on top of the protocol, which I have to say sounds very much like a renegotiation of the protocol to me, but that may be my suspicions. The basic problem that we have is still the trilemma, right? They'll have to come back to the trilemma. And I cannot see a way out of the trilemma other than what we have at the moment, or going back to the deal that was originally negotiated by Theresa May, which is keeping the UK essentially close to Europe. Right? So in terms of the single market and customs union, this was, remember, that was the original deal, which was then rejected. And had that been put in place, then some of what we're talking about now would not have come to pass. But having to deal with the trilemma is not going to go away, right? So either you have, as David rightly said, a border in the in Ireland, and good luck with that. because all the issues in terms of security, it being a target, the rise of nationalism on the border and republicanism on the border is going to come swishing back. So that's a problem. Or you have the UK coming close to the UK, to the EU again in customs and trade. Or you have what we have in the protocol now. That's not going to go away. So I'm not sure what you can do about that, except on the detail. So I guess my problem is that, you know, David's propositions are giving quite unintentionally, I know, you know, this is not a kind of conspiracy at all, but it does risk giving comfort to an increasingly desperate DUP. And the DUP has now boxed itself into a position which it's almost impossible for it to escape. It's made impossibilist demands of getting rid of the protocol, of preserving Article 6 of the Act of Union. I mean, who knew about Article 6 of the Act of Union before, right? This is the provision that guarantees free trade between Ireland and GB. But they've now got themselves into a position where Mr. Donaldson says, I won't go back into government unless we now preserve Article 6 of the Act of Union and therefore get rid of the protocol. Well, that's kind of impossibilist position to get into. So unfortunately, the fears have now been stoked. And you risk, if you say, we'll renegotiate the whole thing, we'll have a new agreement, we'll question the Good Friday Agreement, it risks feeding exactly that set of fears as justified in some way, and they're not justified. The agreement, the protocol, does not change fundamentally the constitutional position. It is workable in the sense of clearly there's going to be trade displacement, but so what? If your sausages come from Dublin as opposed to London, who really cares? So my suggestion essentially is therefore that we've got a deal. It's not a particularly elegant deal aesthetically, you know, who would vote for it? But it is one way of dealing with the trilemma. And it was the deal that the British government agreed to. So I'm afraid I do come back to the alternative, which David sketched out as the alternative he was rejecting, which is that the UK government should actually obey its international legal obligations. It should accept the protocol cannot be written to be essentially closer to the model of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, which is what Lord Frost is aiming for. It should negotiate with the EU in good faith in the Joint Committee. It should drop its provocative posturing over triggering Article 16. It should cease using the Ulster Unionists in Westminster as essentially a way of trying to save the current Prime Minister. It should face down the ERG and its fellow travellers, and it should stop stoking loyalist paranoia of ultimate betrayal. And try to restore something approaching a degree of trustworthiness. But the only way in which it's going to restore trust with the EU, and indeed with a significant section of the population, both nationalist and unionist in Northern Ireland, is if it actually demonstrates consistently that it's going to obey and abide by its agreements. Internally, in terms of the UK, and externally in terms of the EU. That's ultimately the only way of restoring trustworthiness in Dublin, Belfast, Brussels, Berlin, Paris, and Washington, is actually if you agree to something and then abide by it. And they're not doing that at the moment. So the notion of going to something different, of another agreement, which equally there's no prospect necessarily of them committing to and actually implementing, seems to me to be problematic.
Thank you, David.
Apart from that, we agree.
Excellent, that's good to hear. So David, this idea that, you know, if we do layer on top of the protocol, there's going to be some mission creep here, that we are destabilizing the Good Friday Agreement. Do you have any views on that? And also this important point about trust, which I think was raised earlier, and Christopher's just talked about it. How do we restore that?
Yeah, I'm afraid I just don't think that's it's deliverable to just basically say to the UK government and unionists kind of just drop everything you've been saying for the last 2 years and accept all of this as a negotiating position. Coming at it from that, it's not a very good negotiating position. Now, undoubtedly, something that didn't happen in the past that should have happened 2-3 years ago is that after the 1998 agreement was signed, Jonathan Powell spent the next 10 years trying to make it work. He's written a book about it, Great Hatred, Little Room. He gets very frustrated about doing it, but it took 10 years to make that work. Now, so you're going to need to make Northern Ireland and Brexit in some way compatible. You're going to need something like that. You're probably going to need outside help from other countries, like you had with the 1998 process as well. And it's those ways you start to get trust back. But I don't think you can get trust back by starting from the point of saying, some of the actors involved here are just going to have to walk back everything they've said. It's not the starting point I see that we that's going to provide you with the opportunity to make this work. So I'm afraid that's I started from hoping that was the case. It was actually while listening to a senior Irish government figure that I thought this is not going to work. The protocol should have been more like the Good Friday Agreement. The Good Friday Agreement is pretty vague, really, on what it does. It's trying to create a sense, John Hume's single transferable speech is trying to create the sense that he was trying to push over, that even though we kind of ultimately disagree on whether we're Irish or British, actually we can find a way to agree to disagree and to respect all traditions. I don't think that what's happened in the last 2 years allows us now to just go back to the protocol and say the protocol will allow us to create that situation again where we agree we're headed, that we can find a way to disagree on this. And I'm afraid we therefore need to go back to the processes that started in really the early 1990s, and we're in for a long haul again. So I'm sorry about that. I'd love it the answer to be, the UK government just needs to implement this. And I'm afraid even if there's a Labour government or a Labour-led government in 2 years' time, I think it's facing the same issue, because I don't think a Labour-led government can suddenly say, we just we're just going to implement it and stuff the unionists on what they've been saying for 2 years. I just don't think that's the basis for stability either. Now, what you put over there and how you manage to build that structure, I think there's a lot of in my mind that could be in many different ways. I'm not an expert in sort of how you resolve major political tensions, but I think you need to do something, and I think that we need to turn the conversation to that there is a need here. What fills that need? How you do it? There could be many ways of doing that, but I don't think you can just say, I'll just implement it as it is.
So, if I may, a couple of things. One is the assumption I think that David's making is that the unionist position is implacably opposed to the protocol. It's clear, if we're talking politics now rather than law, and I'm conscious I'm talking to lawyers, at least in part, politically, support for the DUP is hemorrhaging, right? So it's just absolutely going out the window in terms of at least opinion polls. Now, opinion polls in Northern Ireland are notoriously inaccurate, but if the trend that's reflected in the polls, opinion polls, is reflected in the elections in May, then the DUP is going to lose heavily seats, both to the TUV on the right and to the Ulster Unionists and an alliance in the middle. So that changes the complexion. The DUP is afraid of the TUV and Jim Allister, and has essentially allowed Jim Allister to set its Brexit policy. So I'm not assuming, as I think David is, that that's a stable position on the unionist side of opposing the protocol in the way that they have up to now. And each of the strategies that have been adopted by the unionists, the DUP really, and Jim Allister, has failed. Right? Notably, the extremely powerful Court of Appeal decision a couple of days ago that took every single argument of the DUP and rubbished it in terms of the arguments that were being made. So that's point one. Don't assume a stability in the unionist population. Second point in terms of, let's take the model of the Good Friday Agreement, which was sort of vague and fluffy and kumbaya. We are in completely changed days now. So the Good Friday Agreement was ultimately based on trust. You might not have thought it at the time, but essentially the trust between the British government and the Irish government was extremely strong because it had been built up over the previous 20 years. And they worked very, very hard at sustaining that trust. It would not have happened apart from that. That's why you have the absence of all of the panoplies of international enforcement that you normally associate with international agreements. There's none of that there. Because it was assumed that there was an underlying set of conventions and trust on which the Good Friday Agreement was based. And for 15 years, that kind of worked. It did work. And it was Brexit that then challenged that. Relations between the UK and Ireland are now at an all-time low. Nothing happens in Northern Ireland unless you're going to have the agreement of the Irish government here, ultimately. And you don't have that. So part of the problem then is fundamental, and this I agree with David. And it's fundamental in the sense that the kind of the good chaps theory of government that David Hennessy talks about, right, has gone. You cannot trust them. They will push conventions to breaking point. They will, as they did in the Internal Markets Bill, threaten to breach international law. So of course you're going to have, for the moment at least, more law if you have more agreements and more hard law. So were you to renegotiate the Good Friday Agreement, would you get what you have now? Absolutely not. It would be in an entirely different form because you'd bring the lawyers in almost on day one, whereas in most cases the lawyers were kept out. So I'm afraid the realpolitik, we're both claiming to be staking our proposals on realpolitik, but the realpolitik is there is not going to be a renegotiation of the protocol. There is not going to be a renegotiation of the Good Friday Agreement. The unionist position is already crumbling in terms of the opposition to the protocol, because I think increasingly there's a sense here, I'm sitting, in Northern Ireland, after all, that the DUP has put itself onto the horns of a very uncomfortable dilemma. We can talk about one-way streets and all of that, whichever metaphor you want to adopt. If the problem is that, which David seems to be identifying, if the problem is the unionists have said things that, to be honest, were pretty stupid, and the question is, how do we get them off that dilemma? Then we can talk seriously, right? Then we can talk about, like Putin and Ukraine, about how to get people out of a difficult position with some degree of dignity and respect for themselves. We can get them off the dilemma, but that is not going to mean renegotiation of any fundamental kind. We have what we have, and we got to make it work.
That's really fascinating. Thank you. I'm conscious that we are reaching the end of our allotted time. I wonder if anyone's got any questions to ask the panelists. And if you could turn off your mute button and turn on your video and tell us who you are, that would be very helpful. Jill Barrett, Do turn off your mute button, Jill.
Yes, well, a quick one for David. When you were talking about setting up some new layer of consultation that involves all four parts of the community, in other words, the Northern Ireland communities as well as the UK and Ireland, I mean, what about the existing joint committee under the Northern Ireland Protocol? Could you not invite the Northern Ireland communities into that, so you have a real four-way negotiation, bearing in mind, of course, what Chris said about Ireland having to be speak as part of the EU. And sorry, if I can just quickly ask any member of the panel another question. It was I'd like to hear more about the consent issue and the fact that there is this opportunity for review in the X years, and what then happens if the Northern Ireland communities do reject the trade provisions, you know, what then? And how do the changing demographics and polls in Northern Ireland look? You know, is that likely to happen? Thanks.
Okay, on the joint committees, I might be slightly biased against them. Joint committees that are set up under agreements like this are generally pretty toothless. And when they're set up like that, that's the issue with them. They're nothing like being a member of the EU for a start. They're very rarely expected to be more than sort of officials checking things are being implemented properly. Yes, you could invite people, Northern Ireland parties along, but the chances are, from where we are, it's not going to deliver enough, or that would be my take on it. For example, at the moment, Northern Ireland Business wants to try to get a tripartite structure going where they host the UK government and the EU together to try to resolve issues as they arise. That's just, they also don't have that much faith in the existing committee structure of it. So that would be my argument. In theory, on the other hand, you can make amendments to the existing, and you know, one can argue that part of my sort of suggestion of political structure, you can do some of this within the agreement if you had that kind of level of agreement and trust. I just don't think you do. Just on the consent issue, it's been written so it's going to succeed. So it's not it's not an issue in terms of strict legalese, because both communities would have to consent in effect for the Northern Ireland Protocol to cease applying, and clearly that's not going to happen. So yeah, it is going to carry on, and the consent mechanism is not going to become an issue. One shouldn't be quite so glib about it, but ultimately that's the effect. I think Christopher was nodding, so I think he probably agrees with that.
Well, yes and no. So let's just start with the consent issue, right? So there's been a lot of chat about the consent issue, and it's become really quite technical. The position essentially will be that a majority decision in the Assembly will decide whether or not to continue or not to continue the trade provisions, that is Articles 5 to 10, essentially, of the protocol. Yeah. Now, why is that significant in the way that I've phrased it? Significant because it does not require cross-community consent. And that's where I shook my head. So it doesn't require both communities formally that are represented in the Assembly, Unionist bloc, Nationalist bloc, which is required for devolved matters to be agreed, to go ahead. Yeah, so any 30 members of the Assembly or whatever can require what's called a petition of concern, which means that a particular vote can only pass if you get a majority of the Unionist bloc and a majority of the Nationalist bloc. That's what the Unionists want with regard to the protocol, and that's what they cannot have and did not have under the protocol. So what they have got is a majority vote in the Assembly. At the moment, there's no prospect whatsoever of a majority vote getting rid of the protocol. That's the simple politics of it. And I think there's even less likelihood of it after the Assembly elections. We'll see. That's my prediction. But it's quite interesting in terms of Lord Frost's recent speech in Zurich, if you haven't read it, because one of his proposals is that the British government, if it fails in its renegotiation tactic, which it will, it should essentially use that assembly election as a mechanism for getting rid of the protocol. And he proposes, somewhat radically, I would have thought, that if the first election to the assembly doesn't result in sufficient numbers who are going to vote against it, you rerun the election. Yeah, precisely. I mean, I'm not making this up. Go to the text of the speech. So at the moment, Jill, to answer your question briefly, there is a mechanism. It's a straight majority. There will not be, I think, any prospect of it being voted down, but it will be a flashpoint for the next 2 years. In terms of the point about the joint committee, 1 point legally and 1 point sort of politically. The EU, since the days of Barnier, and it's continued under the present commissioner, has gone out of its way to consult very widely in Northern Ireland. I mean, they don't have a permanent presence there because they weren't allowed one, but they are talking to the business community daily. They are talking to the voluntary and community sector almost daily, not as frequently, but almost daily. And they're about to bring forward proposals for precisely the type of thing that you're talking about, which is to have a mechanism attached to the joint committee and the specialist committees that would bring in both business and the voluntary and community sector. And that's being negotiated at the moment. So there is a mechanism for that. As to David's skepticism about joint committees, of course, but at the moment, that's the only game in time. There's absolutely no reason why that committee couldn't work. But certainly all I hear from the EU side is that the provisions that the proposals that are being put forward by the government, the British government, are again pretty impossibilist. For example, in terms of getting rid of the European Court of Justice, that's not going to happen with regard to issues of EU law. It cannot happen under EU law, and it won't. So there are considerable flexibilities in the protocol. The protocol was never regarded as the last word in the sense of all of the detailed provisions having to be dealt with at the time of the agreement. It was always assumed there were going to continue to be negotiations within the committee on the details. That was always assumed to be the case. And that's what should continue. You know, we're already in a position where we've got the medicines area pretty well sorted. That kind of model can continue with regard to all the other technical issues, if there is a will to do it. But the notion that, you know, is being put forward in Whitehall, that there are these intense negotiations going on in SPS and so on, that's nonsense. You know, I talked to the guy who deals with it in Brussels, and what intense negotiations means is essentially 1 hour a week on a telephone. You know, this is not serious negotiation. If you want to resolve this stuff technically, you got to take it seriously, and it's not being taken seriously at the moment, largely because there's suspicion in Brussels that they don't want it to work for all kinds of reasons that you can guess.
Thank you. The speakers both assured me they wouldn't mind if we ran on a tiny bit longer, and George Peretz, QCIC, has a question to ask.
Yeah, I'm really picking up on Christopher's last point about lack of trust. I mean, to what extent do you think that a new government coming in without the record of the current government in terms of not threatening to breach international law, resigning from agreements signed, etc., all the reasons that we're familiar with for breakdown in trust. To what extent do you think that a new government that was able to present itself as having a completely clean slate on all of that would be able to explore ameliorations that would actually significantly reduce at least the perceived obstacles to movement that across the Irish Sea that the current arrangements have generated. There's obviously SBS is one aspect of that, but another area may be sort of smoothing customs procedures, exchanges of information, cooperation that enable movements of goods to take place between what will still be different customs territories, but much more smoothly than they are able to do at the moment. To what extent do you think there's room for real improvement there, simply by virtue of having a government that hasn't burnt its trust quite as comprehensively as the current one has?
Yeah. So I suspect I'm going to become even more unpopular at this stage, given that I'm talking to Society of Labour lawyers after all. So you know, the Labour Party is not on a clean slate, and that's part of the problem. And the reason why it's not on a clean slate is because from the point of view of Northern Ireland, it screwed up on Brexit. In terms of the way that was handled within the party and within the government and within negotiations on how to deal with Brexit and the aftermath of it. And so it's not a clean slate from that point of view. And therefore it has some, you know, it's got some need to restore trust in the sense of being a competent interlocutor on some of these issues. That's point one. Point two is it's also not a clean slate because stuff is going through Parliament at the moment on which, you know, the Labour Party could demonstrate both its competence and its commitment, which it's failing to do. So, you know, tonight or tomorrow night, the elections bill is going through the House of Lords. Part of the provisions in the elections bill are, as you well know, disenfranchising EU citizens from voting. Yeah. Now, in terms of Northern Ireland, there is a provision, you know, one of the provisions that David didn't mention in his enthusiasm about the trade aspect of it, which is Article 2 of the protocol, which deals with the preservation of rights in Northern Ireland. That is, that there should be no diminution of rights as a result of Brexit. Well, EU citizens' rights are now going to be deprived. They're clearly going to be diminished. There is an amendment in the House of Lords to restore the status quo ante in order to comply with the protocol. Right? Well, will it be very interesting to see whether there is a heavy turnout of Labour peers to vote for that. These kinds of things are noticed, right? They may appear to be kind of nerdish, but they're noticed in Northern Ireland. So the Labour Party can build trust, but it's not going to build trust if it thinks it's going to come in day one after the election and start building trust. It should start building trust now that it's both competent, has its eye on the ball, and has a backbone with regard to some of these issues that are currently being debated. With regard to the internal market bill, it played a good game. With regard to, you know, the big position, though it let some of the other stuff go through that it should not. But every issue that is coming up, the emphasis is essentially to go for the headline rather than the detail. And until, you know, Labour government or a putative Labour government starts dealing with the detail now in terms of building trust, then if it comes in day one and says, now trust us because it's a clean slate, people will say it's not a clean slate because of the last 3 years, you actually screwed up.
David.
Yeah. Look, the answer is it is never a fully clean slate, but it is always a better slate for the opposition coming in. I think there will be a big question as to whether the Labour Party wishes to make this a priority. And my suspicion is it won't. My advice would be to immediately have somebody in who tries to basically resolve all this, becomes the sort of almost the lead to try and unravel this, to try and basically say, right, the UK, the last government left us a mess. Let's see if we can do something about that. That's always the advantage that a new government has. And I think that if they took that approach right from day one, I think there's a chance that you can do something. I don't know where it finishes up, but I think there's a chance if you take that view. If, as I rather more fear, a new government wouldn't treat this as a priority and would soon get stuck into basically calls from the opposition to say they're going soft on Europe, I think that's going to be the danger with this. I think that the way a Labour government will be judged on this by the media will be to say that any compromise whatsoever on the Northern Ireland Protocol is selling out to Europe. And I think you've got to reckon that that's going to happen, and therefore you've got to be ready for it. I'm not sure that a Labour government will be ready for that, and therefore I fear that it will still be a big problem. So I think that would be my fear. I think the opportunity might be there. It certainly won't be a fully clean slate. I agree with that, but it will be a better slate. Not going to be easy whatsoever, and certainly would really benefit from some thinking ahead of time as to how you're actually going to handle that, and having some stability now in the Labour team which is going to handle Northern Ireland Protocol and frankly other matters of Brexit is really important. It hasn't happened so far, and that really needs to happen. If there's going to be a Labour government that gets to grip with these issues, it needs to start getting to grips with them now. I fear that's not happening.
Well, can I just come back on that slightly? I mean, I advised the Labour front bench in the late 1980s and mid 1990s on both the Good Friday Agreement aspect of it and particularly on fair employment and discrimination issues, which were highly controversial at the time. And it was Kevin McNamara and Mo Molo. Yeah. And you had an equivalent kind of issue to some degree coming up then, which was anything that they did, they were going to be accused of being soft on terrorism, right? So any attempt to, Mo going to the prisoners in the maze, or Kevin talking, in terms of supporting American pressure on in the McBride principles and so on, always accused of being soft on terrorism. You're going to get exactly the same thing. I agree with David. With regard to being soft on Europe. That's what I mean about getting a backbone, right? They have to be prepared to face that down, and they have to be prepared to be prepared to take risks for peace, because that's what we're talking about ultimately here. This is not a game, and it's particularly not a Whitehall or a Westminster game. You're talking about lives being lost potentially here. And I'm not trying to rattle the saber here, I'm just stating simple fact that if this becomes as unstable as it looks like it's going to continue to be, that is a real danger. And the last thing an incoming Labour government wants to deal with is a resurgence of sectarian violence in Northern Ireland. And if people are telling you that that's never going to happen, that is absolutely cloud cuckoo land. You have to know only a minimal amount of information about the history of Ireland to know that violence is always under the surface. And the idea that it's gone away is fantasy. You need a statesman-like approach, which is going to face down the stupidities of analysis about being soft on Europe and decide that you're going to take a responsible, non-negligent approach to what could turn out to be a major problem if it's not handled properly.
Thank you, Christopher. I think we probably have to leave it there. We could all go on much longer. I mean, that was a very sobering note to end on, but it's been an absolutely fascinating, rich and thought-provoking discussion. Thank you so much to both of you. As George said at the start, David's article, which is really helpful and interesting on all this, I think has been circulated. Christopher's book that he's edited, I think, Christopher, you're going to send it to whoever wants it, but it's a rather large attachment. Is that right? So
it's free. You can download it free on open access in Cambridge University Press, and they would be delighted to. George is if you want to read George, which you should, he has a piece in it as well. So it's free on open access.
Thank you so much to both of you. Thank you, and good evening, everyone.
Sorry to be depressing.
Before everyone just disappears, thanks to Eleanor as well for chairing. And I also need just to remind some people, we did send around, there's been a request for Nick Thomas Simons for advice. If you're on the SLL trade mailing list, you should have got it. It'll probably require a bit of work by several people, so I'm keen to get a little group together, have a look and see it. If you can't find it, send an email to Frankie, who will send you a copy of it, and try and get back to Frankie as soon as possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.